Thank you so much, Tom, for that very kind introduction. Shall I launch in? Yeah? Okay.
Sorry, I had already muted. You are up. You're ready to go. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to Tom and Christopher for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be asked and to address this audience today. I'm going to start with a confession. I am technically not a historian. I am a literary scholar. But I have always worked in a very interdisciplinary way, and I've received marks of favour and esteem from historians that have made me feel very welcome. So I know something about the process of doing history now, even though that's not my original training. Um, I know that often you're hearing about military history, and this is something a bit different. So thank you very much for taking a chance on me. If it's not too corny, I am going to tell you about a battle of sorts, a battle of wills between a young woman and an even younger man who wanted very different things from one another and found themselves engaging in all sorts of skirmishes and maneuvers to achieve their objectives. So sit back and enjoy, or maybe at least find interesting, the story of Mary Hamilton and George IV, a possible case of hashtag #MeToo in the Georgian Court. In the early summer of 1779, Mary Hamilton was in a sticky situation. The 23-year-old courtier, who was working as sub-governess to three of the daughters of George III and Queen Charlotte, found herself bombarded with dozens of secret love letters from the princess's brother, the 17-year-old Prince of Wales and the future George IV. In an age when reputation was everything for a young woman, and she had no parent, guardian, or workplace support to protect her, the stakes could not be higher. Should Hamilton risk offending her current monarchs by giving too favourable a response to their son's advances, or risk insulting her future one by rejecting them too forcefully? I'm trying to. Oh no, that's all right. So sorry, I was trying to move on my slides, which didn't work at first. So in recent years, I've been working with several colleagues on the research project Unlocking the Mary Hamilton Papers, which is based at the John Rylands Library in Manchester. And that's the image you can see on the left of the screen, the graphic from our webpage. Among many, many other tasks, we have been piecing together, transcribing, and editing an extraordinary corpus of 139 letters written between Mary Hamilton and the Prince of Wales over the year 1779. And I didn't initially set out to work on these letters. Um, or this relationship. I mentioned that I'm a literary scholar and I was interested in Hamilton's reading practices. But once I read and understood the letters, I felt I had no choice because there was a story there that really needed to be told. So I wrote up my reading of the correspondence, first as a long read blog post for our project website. That's the image you can see at the top right of the screen. And then, at their request, for the UK-based public history magazine History Today, with which some of you might be familiar. And as you can see, the strapline that they chose at History Today was, "This is not a love story." The correspondence between Mary Hamilton and the future George IV is often seen as evidence of a harmless crush in the Georgian court, but it was nothing of the sort. So, as any of you who work in education will know, in student essays, the phrase was often seen or has previously been read, or various iterations of that can cover a multitude of sins and omissions. So, let me tell you exactly what I mean before diving into Mary and George's story itself. The correspondence that I'm discussing today descended through Mary Hamilton's family before being sold and winding up in the Royal Archives, which is where it remains today. They kindly worked with us to produce a digital edition of it. I'll tell you more about that at the end. Extracts from the correspondence were first published in the early 20th century by family members of Hamilton's, including Major Archibald Anson, who was, I think, her nephew, and Hamilton's granddaughters, Florence and Elizabeth Anson. And so the first really published kind of mention of the correspondence, and also the first kind of published extracts from it, were put into the public realm by Archibald Anson in 1920. He said Miss Hamilton, sorry, being in charge of his sisters, saw a good deal of the Prince of Wales and took a sort of motherly interest in him, and for a while exercised a good deal of influence over him. After the Ansons sold the letters to the Royal Archives, they became available to historians. And this is Christopher Hibbert, who was writing a biography of George IV in the 1970s. He says, when he was 16, the prince fell in love with Mary Hamilton. For weeks, he wrote to her almost every day, assuring her of his everlasting devotion. Fast forward a little bit to 2014. Got Janice Hadlow writing in a kind of group biography of the royal family at that time. When he was 16, the highly susceptible Prince of Wales noticed Mary Hamilton and immediately fell in love with her. I'm skipping a little bit here. Mary was flattered, but replied that she could only accept his friendship. It was a relationship of genuinely warm feeling. These quotations to the left of the screen here bring us pretty much bang up to date. And these are actually taken, well, the first one is taken from the Royal Collection Trust's official website, where they have an entry about this correspondence. This is the way that the Royal Collection Trust itself describes it. At their heart, the Prince's letters are love letters and give a strong emotional insight into the character of George IV as a young man. While the letters testify to the prince's clear infatuation with Hamilton, both parties emphasised the importance and the sincerity of their friendship. And when the letters were digitised by the Royal Collection Trust in 2019, there were various write-ups in the media. This is one from The Guardian, national paper here in the UK. The 16-year-old prince who became George IV did not just quietly fancy one of his teachers at court, he absolutely esteemed and loved her more than words or ideas can express. It goes on to describe the Prince of Wales as lovelorn. The pair exchanged several letters, but Hamilton managed to resist George's charms. She instead became a trusted friend and confidant. So I think it's safe to say that in the past, historians, biographers, institutions, media have largely focused on the prince's side of the correspondence, and they've seen the episode as a sort of semi-comical love story or a crush, which really shows a softer side to the young man who would later become the depraved Prince Regent and the very unpopular monarch. So now let me tell you the story as I found it when our team, for the first time, fully transcribed, arranged, and edited the full correspondence, as well as Mary Hamilton's surviving diaries. And then I suppose you can make up your own minds. So Queen Charlotte, there on the right, the wife of King George III and mother of the Prince of Wales, invited Mary Hamilton to court to act as sub-governess to her elder daughters in June 1777. And Hamilton was astonished, in her own words, to receive the invitation. And she said to a friend, I never in my life had the least desire to belong to a court. But it wasn't the kind of invitation you could really refuse. So off she went. Once in post, Hamilton's duties were dictated by royal routine and etiquette. Every day she dined with, walked with, and tutored the three princesses, and every other evening she was summoned to read aloud to the Queen. It must have been quite a difficult environment in which to cultivate friendships, since the surviving evidence suggests that life as a courtier was a weird blend of formality and intimacy. So her young charges, the princesses, often sent her affectionate notes beginning, "My dear Hammy," they called her Hammy, and she did write gratefully of the Queen's kindness and the King's goodness towards her, at least at the beginning. But like other members of staff, she was also constrained by an elaborate set of behavioural codes. For example, attendants were not permitted to sit down in the presence of monarchs, ever, and they were not allowed to accidentally turn their back on them, ever. No courtier was ever permitted to forget that they were in the presence of a superior. In the summer of 1779, when she'd been at court for 2 years, Hamilton was vulnerable and depressed. As well as struggling beneath the weight of her court duties, which she hated, she'd recently been bereaved of her mother. Her father had died some years previously, and she'd been bereaved of no fewer than 5 close friends aged under 40 years old. In the midst of all this, the Prince of Wales seems to have declared his love for her and begun an ardent pursuit of her affections. On the 25th of May, 1779, and you can see a shot of this letter at the side of the screen, he writes, "Your manners, your sentiments, the tender feelings of your heart so totally coincide with my ideas, not to mention the many advantages you have in point of person over many other ladies, that I not only highly esteem you, but even love you more than words or ideas can express." 5 days seem to have passed before Hamilton replied to the prince's bombshell. On the 30th of May, she responds to this declaration with a firm negative. "I can, without injuring my honour, accept your friendship. To listen to more, I should justly forfeit the esteem you say you have for me." She also flatly forbids him to send her gifts. She says, "Do not offend my delicacy by sending me presents. I acknowledge I have a little pride of heart, therefore lay me under no further obligations of that kind. The one you gave me some time ago was a pleasing mark of friendship, therefore I scrupled not to accept it. The rest were superfluous, and I shall return them." And at first, it seems like actually the prince took this on board pretty well. He says, "As you say, you cannot consistently with your honour listen to such proposals. I take heaven itself to witness that I will not intentionally do anything which I think will displease you, and therefore I will as seldom as possible touch upon a subject which is painful to you." But the prince's resolution doesn't last long. On June the 6th, he begs Hamilton to meet him alone in a place called the Butterfly House in the gardens at Kensington Palace at 7 o'clock. Um, "As I have but a single question to ask you," he said. And apparently, this attempted rendezvous didn't go to plan. I haven't got any quotes up about this, but the next letter from the prince to Mary acknowledges how much struck and astonished you was with my sudden appearance. Um, he later feebly claims that this important question he had for Hamilton was whether or not she was in good health. Um, and contrary to his promise to moderate his language, he adds, "I shall love and esteem you as more than any friend during the whole of my life." Hamilton's response to that letter does not survive, but she apparently used it to take the prince to task in some way, because in his next extant letter, dated the 20th of June, he reproaches her for her quote too cruel words. Apparently, these included a firm request to stop writing to her, since the prince responds, "I consent, according to your desire, to drop our clandestine intercourse by letter, unless something particular happens concerning which I wish to ask your advice." It's not sure whether that caveat belongs to him or to Hamilton. As June turns into July, the prince continues to give vent to his feelings in the letters. On the 24th of July, he tells Hamilton, "I dote upon and adore you beyond the idea of everything that is human." And on 26th of July, he swears, I most willingly, were this the condition of my being eternally united to you, retire to some unknown place, give up all my future prospects in this world and all its pageantry, and live in retirement, happiness, and love with you." He persists in sending her gifts, such as a toothpick case, a smelling bottle, and a bracelet, despite her firm request to the contrary. He also pesters her for a lock of her hair, claiming, I shall keep it in your absence as the representative of my dear friend and love it accordingly. There is no evidence that she ever did send him her hair. This is the hair that was found in the pocketbook of her eventual husband, John Dickinson. We're not sure it's Mary Hamilton's hair. It might be their daughter Louisa's hair, but it's got a pretty good chance of being Hamilton's. Hamilton never swerves from her consistent and emphatic rejections of George's advances. But it's clear that she's painfully conscious of the power imbalance between them and that she feels she has to walk a really fine line to avoid, on the one hand, displeasing the prince, and on the other, creating suspicion in the king and queen, should they ever find out about this, that she's encouraging their son's advances. And she employs a range of strategies to keep her balance on this line, I'd say, which show her adapting shrewdly and creatively to the prince's attentions. By July, for example, she seems to have realised that telling him not to write to her is pointless. So she seems to instead have started keeping very careful records of the correspondence, filing the prince's letters by date and instructing him to return or burn her own letters. And she's also very careful to repeatedly state in writing her objections to his pursuit and his fears about how his partiality for her might affect her reputation. So we've got a couple of examples here. I am tortured with some uneasy reflections which I cannot stifle. Remember, sir, my fame is, that's my reputation, is dearer to me than life. For however innocent the motives which influence, the world would naturally, and particularly two persons, would put a cruel construction upon a secret and clandestine correspondence, were it ever to transpire. She is careful too to explicitly remind him of his own station in life, so different to her own. You forget surely that Providence has placed you in a situation which it is and will be your duty to support in every respect and act up to in every instance. And she also praises his parents, her employers, with great fervour. She's very careful to do that. Perhaps recognizing that the prince was never going to stop sending her presents, no matter how much she pleaded, Hamilton begins to return them. So she says on the 3rd of July, for example, I do not choose to accept the present. Be so good then as to give me a proof of your friendship. Take it back without being offended. Once more, I tell you, I will not, I never will lay myself under obligations. I have not the power of returning. In a little while, she says, I will not accept any more presents. I will not lay under any obligations. Mine is not a friendship upon sordid, vulgar terms. So she keeps banging this drum. And her firmness on this point reminds us that in this time and in this place, gift culture bore a raft of meanings that might not be immediately clear today. In her book, The Game of Love in Georgian England, Sally Holloway explains that material objects, from letters to locks of hair, held a central place in rituals of courtship and were used to negotiate, cement, and publish a match. So the exchange of gifts was a crucial form of language. Hamilton keeps repeating the word obligation with regard to the prince's unwanted gifts. Clearly, she is alert to the symbolic power of gifted objects, and she wishes to make crystal clear that she is not and does not wish to be in the prince's debt. Oh, sorry, I accidentally clicked a link to one of the letters. Can you see my PowerPoint again now? Yeah, okay, great. By the 23rd of July, Hamilton seems to have mentioned to the prince in a letter that's now been lost that she wanted to leave her position at court. And in one letter, she tells him that she loves, quote, independence and liberty, and hints that this desired state is incompatible with her current employment. And this is a really striking moment. In one respect, Hamilton undoubtedly means simply that she wishes to be free of her duties and to manage her own time. But it's far from clear that that's her only meaning. I probably don't need to tell you that in the year 1779, independence and liberty are very, very charged words because they are precisely the words that American colonists are using to argue for secession from a tyrannical monarch, the Prince of Wales's father, George III. It's possible, I think, though there's no way of proving it, that Hamilton is deploying that vocabulary to communicate to the prince the cruelty of the position in which his attentions are placing her. In response to this, the prince threatens to kill himself if she leaves. I am thoroughly resolved not to survive your loss. Think not that this is the resolution of a giddy, rash, wild young man. It has arisen from the constant contemplation of a strong and sound mind. Hamilton's response to this threat, I haven't put it up here, but it's refreshingly phlegmatic. She replies simply, I repeat, I will not go at present. George makes his threat again a couple of days later. You never will think of making use of that liberty unless you wish to see me lie breathless and lifeless at your feet. And once again, Hamilton replies, I will not go at present, ask no further explanation. At this point, the prince's strategy takes a really unpleasant turn. Between the 26th and the 28th of July, Hamilton seems to have written a letter to him that doesn't survive. Um, but we do have his response dated the 28th, and he indicates that in the letter she wrote him, which he acknowledges was stained by her tears, she outlines her misfortunes. That's a quote. She says that she wishes she had never seen him, and she says again that she wants to leave her post. And in response, the prince tells her, and I really think this is an attempt at emotional blackmail, that at present she's perfectly safe, but if she leaves, then people will have reason to believe that there was a relationship between them. He warns her, the world would construct the innocent visits of my messenger, as well as the little attentions I've shown you, into some private reasons, and they would then think they'd found out a cause for your departure, which I do not think of a nature fit to be mentioned to a person who has such disinterested, honourable, and virtuous notions as my dearest friend has. Perhaps feeling that this isn't clear enough, he then reiterates, if you was to go soon, you would not only ruin me in the opinion of the world, but what is much more dear to me in the eyes of my parents, for I could not conceal the agonies I should feel. What had given rise to Hamilton's sharpened anxiety was probably the realization that in the claustrophobic environment of the court, people were beginning to notice the prince's attachment to her and to draw their own conclusions. At some point in early August, William Ramus, a page of the back stairs, seems to have become curious about the relationship between the prince and Hamilton, and on the evening of the prince's birthday, he apparently probed him about it over a stiff drink. And whatever George said in response seems to have made its way swiftly around the court and back to Hamilton herself. Hamilton, who had long thought Ramus a little noxious animal, reproves the prince about his indiscretion, and she warns him that any further confidence he's made to insignificant characters like Ramus will result in the withdrawal of her friendship. But she charges him not to reproach Ramus for his indiscretion because presumably she didn't want to fan the flames of his suspicion anymore. The prince protests his innocence, but Hamilton seems unconvinced, and throughout the remainder of August and the beginning of September, she apparently received more teasing on the subject. So she seems to have started treating the prince with marked coldness, resulting in him imploring her not to be too hasty and crediting the reports of prating idle people. However, there are times when it's difficult to believe that the prince's aim really is to put Hamilton's mind at rest about this. On several occasions, he actually takes it upon himself to report malicious court gossip about Hamilton to her directly. For example, he tells her that an unnamed gentleman, seeing her walking with the prince, remarked that he never saw a plainer girl than Hamilton in all his life. And on another occasion, he tells Hamilton that somebody's drawn a caricature, which is making the rounds, of Hamilton with a toad in her mouth. This implies that she is a toad eater, which is not a kind of slang term used of someone who was an over obsequious dependent, a sort of suck up or gold digger. There's a lovely caricature there by Rowlandson of a toad eater. On yet another occasion, it seems that the prince hinted that Hamilton was unpopular and friendless. So her response to that insinuation survives, and even though his insinuation itself doesn't, and you can see it at the bottom bullet point there. So you are vain enough, she says, to suppose I shall, from all your fine speeches and protestations, begin to imagine you are the only person in the world that really cares for poor Miranda. Miranda is a nickname she uses. It's unclear whether the prince's tittle-tattling is some sort of attempt to curry favour with Hamilton, to destabilise or isolate her, or something else. I think of it as negging. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term. It's a term that younger people than me use today to, it's a sort of pickup artist strategy where you basically kind of roundaboutly insult the target of your attentions in an attempt to undermine their confidence, and then in contrast, your own kind of compliments to them have more power. I think that's what he's doing. Um, Anyway, Hamilton, it appears to fail because Hamilton really does laugh off any comment on her looks or her poverty. She jokes that she's surprised she gets off so lightly, and she kind of gently encourages him to rise above the silly gossip of the court. And there's a real marked contrast in that response to the genuine distress and anxiety that she seems to feel when it's her relationship to the prince that is under scrutiny. It might be worth taking a moment at this point to ask, why was Hamilton so terrified about her correspondence with the prince being noticed and talked about? One could be forgiven for thinking there were worse fates at this time than being the avowed favourite of the future king. Over the next few years, many women would succumb to his advances, and some of them didn't do too badly out of it. So, why wasn't Hamilton more flattered by and receptive to the prince's declarations? Leaving aside the issue of personal attraction, or more likely a lack of it, the answer lies partly in Hamilton's socio-economic status. She was descended from a noble family and connected by blood or marriage to the powerful Greville, Napier, and Stormont clans. But compared to most of the people in the circles in which she moved, she had very little wealth of her own. She was an orphan without brothers and sisters. If she left court, which she clearly wanted to do, she'd depend for her sustenance on the rent from a house that her mother had left her and a very small settlement that her uncle Frederick managed on her behalf. And when she did leave court, by the way, she lived a very frugal lifestyle in accordance with this income. She lived in a house share arrangement with two friends, which is, of course, very common now, but was extremely unusual at the time. It was thought to be very, very strange. And they did that so that they could split bills. Um, and this might not sound too bad, and of course, by most people's standards at the time, it wasn't. But a woman of Hamilton's class was not trained or conditioned to work for a living, and so she had absolutely no ability to generate her own income. If she wanted to be part of the thriving social and intellectual culture of London, which she did, she'd need to either marry a man who could support her or else stay single, but live very frugally and rely on the generosity of friends who could offer her hospitality, introductions, and favours, such as the loan of a carriage, books, and their servants' services. And later in her life, we see her using all those things. So her ability to make that marriage or to preserve those friendships, her social capital, if you like, derived largely from her reputation for virtue and respectability. It's well known that severe double standards operated in Georgian high society around the chastity of young men and young women. And the ton could be ruthless to even very noble young women whose virtue was in question. So any whisper of an illicit liaison with the prince would have cast Hamilton as an immoral gold digger, incurred the wrath of the king and queen, shocked and alienated her friends, and tarnished her marriage prospects for good. So we can turn briefly either to Mary Hamilton's own words to see what's at stake. So in the top quotation on this slide, she says, "If by any unforeseen chance it should hereafter be discovered, the two persons most dear to you, the prince's parents, would naturally judge me with great severity. Your mother would detest me as being a most designing, artful character, not a human creature. Not even my best friends would do me strict justice." Okay, so that's her word on the matter. We can also turn to the story of an unfortunate young woman called Harriet Vernon. Now, I've only found one account of this, which is in the very first biography of George IV, written in 1830 by a guy called Robert Huish. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. And she was a young maid of honor who Huish describes as his first conquest. If this did take place before Mary's correspondence with George, it can't have been by very long at all, given that he was only 16 when that correspondence started. Anyway, Harriet Vernon did succumb to the prince's advances and did sleep with him. And this is a small part of what Hoosh says about her, which is kind of horrible in the cumulative version. He had enjoyed the kernel, the shell was not worth his keeping, and he threw it away to hasten in search of another which had yet of something of value to give him. So he abandoned her basically and ignored her and cut her off cold. Hoosh then suggests that that the Queen found out about the liaison, and kind of gave the prince a rap over the knuckles for it. And then he concludes that Harriet Vernon was fired in a really horrible, jokey sort of way. A few days previously to this conversation, Harriet Vernon had ceased to be an honourable maid. The day subsequent to it, she was no longer a maid of honour. So I think we can get a good idea from that of if George wasn't good to his word, what would happen if such kind of inferences were placed on his correspondence with Hamilton. Such was the fate that Hamilton wished to avoid. The Ramus affair seems to have blown over for a while, but Hamilton still had a lot on her plate because the prince's passion continued unabated, sorry, over the autumn. He sent her bouquets of flowers twice a week. The top bullet point on the slide there is his admission that he crept into her Windsor apartment and found a sprig of foliage that she had worn as a bouquet, and he seized it and kissed it with a fervour beyond expression before putting it in his bosom. He's also very unpleasantly jealous of her talking to other men, particularly her family friend Francis Lord Napier, who she'd known from childhood. Hamilton continues to respond patiently and consistently to the prince's overtures. You can see an example of that in the middle. Once again, she's banging the same drum. I will never encourage you to express any other term than friend. But later in the autumn, she starts to cast herself in a new role, which I find really, really interesting. That of the prince's severe moral advisor. And this is because in August, I don't know why, but he'd asked her to make all the remarks you can on my conduct, give me all the advice you can. Kind of a form of sucking up, I think. And Hamilton really takes him at his word. She gives him what she calls a terrible blacklist, reprimanding the prince severely over several letters about his bad language, his vanity, his susceptibility to flattery, his tendency to boast and ignore advice, his extravagant foppish dress sense. She recommends that he read moral essays about the impropriety of swearing, and she pours very cold water on his enthusiasm for racy novels. And these are some of my favourite letters in the archive, and I particularly adore the one where she gets quite harsh about his shoes and shoe buckles, which I've put on the final bullet point there. I was hurt 2 days ago with some unpleasant reflections with regard to your dress, which was styled coxcomical, and particularly your shoes and buckles, which were remarkably tight and large. So this persona of stern instructor seems to offer Hamilton some respite from the romantic role in which the prince insists on casting her, to give her, in other words, a part that she felt comfortable playing. And although William Rammer stirs the pot now and again, and Hamilton is still melancholy, as she puts it, her correspondence to the prince from November and early December feels to me more relaxed than it had been previously. Although frequently scolding him or reproaching him for his shortcomings, she appears at some moments to genuinely value his friendship. She also, for the first time, appears to send him an unsolicited gift, a ring, which I suspect is an attempt to balance the books of obligation for something that he had previously sent her. And he thanks her for extremely emotive terms for this present on December the 4th. But the very next day, he would write her a letter that would change the course of the correspondence and mark the beginning of its end. I was delighted at the play last night, the Prince writes to Hamilton on the 5th of December, and was extremely moved by two scenes in it, especially as I was particularly interested in the appearance of the most beautiful woman that ever I beheld. And this, of course, was the actress Mary Robinson, an extraordinarily interesting woman in her own right and a very talented poet in later years. The prince admits later in the letter that he has seen Robinson both on and off the stage, and that he now considers himself to be in love. He finishes the letter imploring Hamilton to pardon, pity, and comfort him, and also not to tell his parents. Hamilton's response to this declaration 2 days later is concerned but not unsympathetic. She doesn't endorse his choice. A female in that line has too much trick and art not to be a very dangerous object, she warns him, reflecting a misogynist prejudice against actresses. But she doesn't reprove him either, and she doesn't seem to find the news that surprising. She makes it very clear that she doesn't think she has anything to pardon him for. However, in subsequent letters, her tone becomes markedly more negative, probably because she's learned what the prince knew all along, that Robinson was already married with a young child. She implores George not to lay yourself open to the world in a character to which you would blush to sign your name. But the prince shows himself all of a sudden newly deaf to her advice. He brushes aside her concerns and starts to excuse himself for not writing to Hamilton more often or at greater length. The religious language that he's used to address her in the majority of the correspondence is also markedly absent from this point forward. By mid-December, Hamilton seems to feel that it would be best to put an official end to the correspondence. The prince has basically stopped writing to her, and when he does, he cannot drop what she calls the detestable subject that she feels is unfit for your sister. This is one of for that's her. She refers to herself as the prince's sister. This is one of her last letters to him, or a quote from it. As I plainly perceive, my friend, that it is a very great inconvenience to you to continue a correspondence with me, and as your politeness will perhaps induce you to give yourself the trouble of keeping it up, permit me to tell you I free you from the constraint. Adieu. That you may be happy is the first wish of my heart, and if the knowledge of the steadiness of my friendship will afford you any satisfaction, know that I shall ever be the same, nor shall I ever deviate from my professions, for they were made with sincerity. It's difficult to judge the tone of this letter. I imagine that Hamilton did have very mixed feelings about the prince's fling with Mary Robinson and subsequent coolness towards her. She was probably sincerely grieved for him, since this didn't bode well for his moral character or his relationship with his parents. She was probably also a little bit relieved that he had transferred his affections to a different object. She may have been chagrined with the swiftness with which he dropped their correspondence and forgotten their friendship. Most of all, I wonder whether she felt afraid. Because up to this point, the main card she'd had to play in the relationship was the threat of withdrawing her favour or her friendship. And if the prince no longer cared for that, what was to stop him saying anything he liked about her to William Ramus or to anybody else? As far as we know, the correspondence between the prince and Mary Hamilton finished with the year 1779. Hamilton herself remained at court until 1782, after which she finally secured permission from the Queen, on what was at least her second attempt, to resign and pursue the independence and liberty she'd always craved. It looks as if Hamilton was wise to keep the prince at arm's length, but was he ever sincere in his declarations of love before Mary Robinson crossed his eye line, or was the pretty sub-governess just a bit of fun to him? It's difficult to say for sure. At one point, he refers to himself as Hamilton's hopeful future husband, and at another, he says he wishes to enjoy the joys of matrimony with her. But at other times, he admits that his rank would prevent their union. We have noted earlier the unhappy example of Harriet Vernon to show us what could happen to vulnerable female courtiers who succumbed to his advances. In the years following her departure from court, before she married and moved away from London, Mary Hamilton often crossed paths with the prince in the West End. We're lucky enough to have a full run of her manuscript diaries between 1782 and 1785, which can offer some clues about how she remembered her situation at court. And once again, I interpret the evidence very differently to previous biographers. The Anson sisters, Hamilton's granddaughters, offer a diplomatic impression of well-wishing. They say Miss Hamilton never ceased her interest in the prince and always looked for the best in him, and he always treated her with courtesy when they chanced to meet. Christopher Hibbert, in his biography of the prince, hints at positive fondness. They remained on friendly terms and often met in later years. The prince always spoke of her with affection and respect, and she, when criticisms of his behaviour were voiced in her presence, took his part as often as she could. In fact, though, Hamilton's diaries contain accounts of several incidents that indicate she was embarrassed by the prince in public, scornful of him in private, and wary of him when they crossed paths, which, at least immediately following her departure from court, she tried to avoid as much as possible. Now, it's only fair to say before we get to these incidents that most of Hamilton's references to the prince are studiedly neutral. She notes when she sees him, including any gestures that he makes to her, such as bowing and kissing, but she doesn't often comment explicitly on what she thought or how she felt. She also notes occasions when the prince is mentioned at conversation at the social gatherings she attended. And these mentions were often unfavourable because he was in the full throttle of his much desired own independence at this point, generating gossip due to his affairs, his gambling, and his general hell-raising. And Hamilton tends to simply report what she hears rather than offer her own view. But there are exceptions, such as the occasion in 1784, the third very short bullet point down here, when the company is lamenting the prince's behaviour, and Hamilton notes, "I took his part when I could." Now, what Christopher Hibbert has done here is smoothly substitute when I could for as often as she could. I am more inclined to see the dry underline of could, indicating that Hamilton could not in good conscience take his part very often at all. In spring 1784, the prince got one of Hamilton's relatives to invite her to a ball at Carlton House, which was his pad, and she tried to excuse herself, but her relatives told her that she shouldn't. So in the end, she attended the gathering and it went off okay. This is how she reports it in her diary. The prince's attentions were properly divided, and nothing, in my opinion, could be more proper, more gracious, more like a gentleman and a prince than his behaviour. What a pity that one who knows so well to how do what is right ever fails of doing so. As soon as we came out of the supper rooms, I, being very prudent, got Mr. Digby to conduct me to my chair and came home about 4:15. So this extract suggests Hamilton's relief that the prince's attentions were what she calls properly divided, and indicates that this good behaviour presents something of a contrast with her expectations. But most striking of all is her description of her own conduct as prudent in getting Stephen Digby, an old friend from the court days, to conduct her to her chair home. She clearly felt that it would be unwise to make this short journey alone. Some more evidence throughout 1784. At one point, Hamilton notes seeing the Prince of Wales, who passed by to go to one of his mistress's houses. Fortunately, she says, my italics, he did not see me. But on another occasion after Christmas, she wasn't quite so lucky. And this is the long second bullet point here. She was writing this account to her new fiance, John Dickinson, whom she would marry the following year. She tells how the prince passed her coach and called to the coach to stop. He came to talk to her. He took her hand, said how happy he was to see her. A whole dialogue follows, which I won't report here. And then at the end, away he went. She reports to Dickinson, he kept my hand the whole time, which greatly distressed me, as there were many bystanders. John Dickinson is also the recipient of the journal letter in which Mary recounts her last and perhaps her most important encounter with the prince. She tells him that she tells her fiance that she was attending a grand concert when Colonel Gerard Lake, an old acquaintance from the court days and a favourite of the prince's, engaged her in a curious conversation. And he was basically saying to her, the prince has told me about the correspondence between you and that you were very well behaved and that you never succumbed to his advances. That's my paraphrase, but that's what he's talking to her about. Hamilton then goes on to say something remarkable to Dickinson. You know, she says, that he, Colonel Lake, is young Marl's favourite. He told me the RH, His Royal Highness, he was coming. So I, for reasons, chose to get away. Okay. Now, what surprises me here is not the fact that Hamilton was once again trying to give the prince the slip. It's the name that she uses for him, young Marl. In her journal letters, Hamilton often uses code names for her acquaintance for various reasons that I probably don't have time to go into. And when she edited these letters in later life, she quite often glosses the code names for the readers so they can see who she's referring to. But one code name that she never ever glosses and that she tries to eradicate so it can't be read is the one she uses for the Prince of Wales. It is diligently crossed through, so you can't read it on almost every occasion. And this is the one instance I found where she omitted to do that. Whether she let it stand because she thought the identity wasn't clear, or whether she simply missed it as she went on her censoring rampage, it's impossible to say. But what does young Marl mean? My best guess, and I have been supported and assisted by my teammates in this respect, is that this is a reference to John Dryden's 1667 comedy, Sir Martin Marl, or The Feigned Innocents. Hamilton was very fond of Dryden's poetry and drama, and she quotes him throughout her diaries, letters, and manuscript books. In the dramatis personae for this play, Sir Martin Marl is described bluntly as a fool. He is, moreover, if you read the play, which I have done, a lecher and a coxcomb who is mocked by all who know him and is eventually outwitted by a clever servant. I've placed one choice quotation from the clever servant character, Warner, here. This it is to serve a coxcomb, one that has no more brains than just those I carry for him. Well, of all fops commend me to him for the greatest. He's so opinioned of his own abilities that he is ever designing somewhat, and yet he sows his stratagem so shallow that every door can pick him up. From a plotting fool the Lord deliver me. Such is the code name that it seems Hamilton and her fiancé chose to refer to their future king. Or at least that's our best guess so far. So I've argued that while the Prince of Wales's conduct towards Mary Hamilton may or may not have looked like love from his perspective, it looked much more like harassment from hers. And I've drawn on Hamilton's own words to show why I believe this. By her own account, she was frightened, distressed, tortured, melancholy, and uneasy. She told the prince in a letter stained with her tears that she wished she'd never seen him. She told him that she wanted to leave her disagreeable situation. After her departure, I think the most charitable word that we can use to describe her attitude to the prince is mixed. She seldom described him in positive terms, frequently mentioned him in negative ones, and made every effort to avoid him. This is, of course, correspondence with a context. Archives do not exist in a vacuum. Somebody has always, mindfully or otherwise, kept certain things and discounted or excluded others. These letters were kept, preserved, and curated by Mary Hamilton and bequeathed to her descendants before winding up in the Royal Archives. They are not a complete run. There are many gaps and mysteries, and the collection includes far more letters written by the Prince than by Hamilton herself. We know that many of her letters were burned by the Prince at her own command. Others were returned to her, after which she would have had the chance to destroy or censor them. Those who held the letters after her death might also have censored further, although we have no reason to believe that they did so. We must recognise that we are looking at the record that Hamilton and others, through whose hands her archive past, wanted to retain. But we do need to be quite careful here. As I researched Hamilton's relationship with the prince, I, a young-ish female researcher in 2021, steeped in the lessons of the METOO movement, still caught myself more than once looking at her conduct with almost as critical an eye as her contemporaries, and questioning the veracity of her statements to an unwarranted degree. Did a friendly word towards George, I wondered, mean that she was leading him on? When she threw in a word of praise among several dozen of criticism, should this be read as evidence that she enjoyed his attentions? Might her lost letters have contained encouragement or even reciprocation? And did her horror at his liaison with Robinson, which heralded the end of their friendship, smack of jealousy? But there is little reason to believe these things. There is little reason to believe, in fact, anything other than what the evidence on the page suggests, that the Prince of Wales harassed Hamilton even in the face of her discomfort and distress, and that she did not enjoy it. I'm going to conclude, because I know I'm getting up to an hour now, and I'm sorry for testing your patience, by asking why it matters. From the historiographical point of view, one answer to this question is that these letters cumulatively present a very rare sort of primary source indeed. Natalie Hanley-Smith puts it very well in a recent post where she discusses one single letter that describes a sexual assault from the victim's point of view. Real-life early modern accounts of sexual harassment or assault told in epistolary form are quite rare. While there are several examples of letters that describe fictional sexual assaults and rapes in contemporary novels, there's a title page from Pamela or Virtue Rewarded by Samuel Richardson there. The real-world accounts the historians have focused on tend to be those that have survived predominantly as court records and publications relating to trials. Consequently, victims' accounts tend to follow certain structures, and accounts of rape, both attempted and actualised, appear far more often than less violent assaults. Moreover, aristocratic women seldom feature as plaintiffs in rape litigation cases, and therefore we know very little about their negative sexual experiences. So in this context, a collection of 139 letters written from both sides in the moment over a period of more than 6 months is a rare find indeed. But I'm going to go a little bit further. I'm going to say that Mary Hamilton's story matters because, to paraphrase the underpinning rationale of much public history, the stories that we are told about our ancestors help us to understand our own experiences today. And unfortunately, things have not changed as much since 1779 as we might wish. In the UK today, at least 40% of women experience sexual harassment in the workplace. When they questioned female MPs working in the Houses of Parliament, our primary seat of constitutional power, the Fawcett Society found that almost 70% of female MPs said they'd witnessed sexist behaviour in the workplace. To the best of my knowledge, no research has ever been conducted into the workplace's experience of the over 1,000 members of staff who work for Buckingham Palace. Since the METOO movement erupted several years ago, it has become a commonplace that sharing stories of abuse can help other survivors to feel connected to a wider community and to feel less alone. In the words of the UK charity Women's Aid, such stories bust stereotypes about who experiences abuse, help others recognise abuse, and show that there is a life after abuse. As such, it's a privilege to work on a project committed to recovering Mary Hamilton's own voice and reconstructing her experiences as she preserved them for posterity. This story of a disagreeable situation at court is not a love story, so we shouldn't call it one. I'm delighted to have done a small part in changing the narrative. You'll recall that at the beginning of the talk, I showed you a headline from a national newspaper covering the correspondence as simply evidence of a lovelorn teenager's love and devotion. And I am happy to finish with one covering the research of myself and my project team with the words that you see on the screen. I've listed here a few useful links, including our project website, my original write-up of the findings, the digital edition where you can pore over the letters themselves, both as high-res images and conveniently edited transcriptions, a radio programme I made for the BBC, which tells the story on location at Kensington Palace with some superb guests, and, of course, my contact details. I would absolutely love if anyone was to get in touch to give me your thoughts, any feedback, any indication of, what you think about the argument. And I will now be delighted to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much. This was fantastic. And I have been jotting down some questions. Tom likes to laugh at me because my job is supposed to be bringing forward questions from the audience, and half the time I just ask all my own questions and don't get to any of the audience, but I will do my best. But the one thing that well, first off, I have to say thank you because you anticipated several of my questions. I'm sort of crossing them off as we go, and one of my standard one is naturally this is it almost feels like the beginning of a story. So I was going to say, if we want to learn more, what should we do? And then you've anticipated that right there. Thank you.
So sorry, Sophie, can you stop sharing screen and then that way we can see you better? And then I'll add that anything you have a hyperlink to, I will add that into the talk description on the video so people can access those links.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, Chris, carry on with your list.
Thank you. So just before we get to our questions, I really appreciated at the end where you said, why is this important? Why, I mean, as historians, we sort of say the most common question is, so what? Why am I doing this? Why is it important? And you really addressed that. And I only wanted to, not quite a separate reason, but sort of building off your last point of the Me Too is that it is very easy for us in the 21st century to lose the agency of these women. especially the sort of background characters of these very important characters. So, the mistresses, even Maria Fitzherbert, who was sort of the Prince of Wales' biggest, most well-known, right? She tends to become very much a background character and just moves in and out of his life. But you've really shown us the agency that these women can have, and that's hugely important as we're studying this history to remember that they were real people and they made real decisions for better or for worse. And I think that's really, really fantastic the way you brought that out. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Um,
Can I just say I'm really pleased you
so,
brought up Maria Fitzherbert. Can I quickly say why? So
absolutely. Yeah.
there were lots of things that didn't make the cut for this talk, which if you want to go to the original write-up, which I know you've seen, Chris, they attach them in more detail. There's one of those chunks was I sort of look at the prince's relationships with other women later in life. I was kind of haunted by this question of like at the time, did he mean it? From Hamilton's point of view, I suppose it doesn't really matter, but I felt very scrupulous about trying to be fair to him. Like, did he really mean it? And his relationship with Maria Fitzherbert later on, as we know it, from what we know of it, is remarkably similar to his pursuit of Hamilton. He makes exactly the same threats to her, especially, I'm going to kill myself. If you don't marry me, I'm going to kill myself. He stages this, as you may know, he stages this bizarre scene where he's telling her he stabbed himself and he's going to die. But actually, it's thought now, he was using some blood from a medical procedure earlier. And that's how he gets her to marry him. And one thing that, that's really horrible and grim in lots of ways, but one thing that, he did put his money where his mouth was. He did, in fact, marry Maria Fitzherbert. But with Harriet Vernon, he didn't. So, that kind of like, for me, that sort of kept the jury out a lot on, whether he was being cynical when he was saying all this stuff to Mary Hamilton or whether in the moment he genuinely believed it. The story of Maria Fitzherbert was very helpful in getting me to move away from solely Harriet Vernon's story and take other possibilities into account. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's fantastic because I found myself just crossing off another question, which was, it's sort of comparing and contrasting this relationship, right? With I guess the more famous one, but no, that's perfect. That was exactly where I was going to go. So thank you. Sort of unrelated. I wonder, is there ever any evidence that George III or Queen Charlotte had any notion of this? Was there ever any indication that maybe they expressed some displeasure about it or anything like that?
Yeah. So basically, I don't have any hard evidence that they definitely knew. There was no reported conversation like the one with Harriet Vernon. But one thing I didn't have time to talk about is that without doubt, Mary Hamilton left court under a cloud. And it may be, okay, so my evidence for her leaving court under a cloud is that she received no pension, which another later courtier with a very analogous kind of story and role and timescale to her, Frances Burney, who was employed at court against her will as well. She received quite a hefty pension when she left from the Queen. We know that. So it seems like that was the standard practice, and Hamilton didn't receive one. Hamilton was also never invited back to court. And her diary contains numerous references where she says something along the lines of, I went to my older friend or relative and told them the story of what happened at court, and they agreed that the royal family had treated me very badly. Now it's different variations on that. And it doesn't ever refer specifically to the prince. So it is possible that something else happened. The most boring explanation could simply be that Charlotte, perhaps unsurprisingly for a queen, was a bit of a diva and she didn't like people leaving her. It kept happening because she was a terrible employer, but she clearly thought she treated her staff very well and they should be loyal to her and stay with her for life. And she was very upset when Hamilton left. So that's the boring explanation. And then she just kind of didn't give her a pension and snubbed her in the future. And that's why, the relatives thought that Hamilton had been treated badly. There's also the possibility that she had quite a falling out with one of the princesses. Our only evidence for this is that there is a draft letter in Hamilton's archive, which is addressed to one of the princesses, which she almost certainly never sent, but which basically has a go at the princess for mistreating her. So we don't know if that was actually like a thing, whether they kind of fell out, or whether Hamilton was just letting off some steam, kind of writing out a sort of private letter. We've probably all done that at some point. To me, it feels not unlikely that Charlotte did hear about or get some later inkling. I don't think while it was going on they knew, but I think possibly later on, as with Gerard Lake, he says, "Oh, the prince told me that you had this correspondence for ages." I think probably he told other people as well, and that it probably got back to the king and queen, and that may have played a part in why she was um so snubbed. The other piece of evidence is that Frances Burney, who is my main research interest really, because she's a novelist and dramatist as well as a courtier. She reports several times in her diary that the Queen did not have good things to say about Mary Hamilton, but unfortunately, she doesn't say what they are. So yeah, we know there was something, we just don't know what it is. And my kind of novelist's imagination really wants to just kind of say, "Oh God, it was the prince, definitely." But my kind of, scholarly side is saying, "No, you've really got to just wait this one out. Try and go to the Royal Archives whenever you can, and because there's still a lot of unpublished stuff there, and just, wait to put together a case that is at least as robust as the one that you've got already for the relationship stuff." So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. It's very tempting, right? Like you say, but it is I mean, especially with all the rumors that are flying, it's really tempting to see that, you know, you have to think that the king and queen have their ear to the ground at least a little bit. But yeah, thank you. Tom, did you want to jump in?
yeah, I just wanted to intervene your line of questioning because this sort of touches upon what one I made a note of. I'm just curious. You had an image of one of the Prince of Wales letters. Is that his own handwriting? Or is that like a clerk or an aide or someone that would write that on his behalf?
I believe that's his handwriting.
Very nice penmanship. So
Yep, can't fault his penmanship.
and then I just wonder how private would this correspondence truly be? Like, would he pass the letters directly to her? Would someone walk them over on his behalf? Like,
Yeah, it's such a good question. He had a messenger. He refers to his messenger several times. And I think we have the initials somewhere, but I haven't been able to match them to the initials of anybody I know at court at that time. Um, the messenger carries correspondence between them, and the messenger also brings her flowers from him. So clearly, there's one person who obviously knows everything. I don't know who that was. It wouldn't have been William Ramus because Hamilton calls him a noxious little animal. That's not. She wouldn't accept anything that he brought. But in my head, this mysterious messenger is some kind of page of the back stairs, like Ramus, somebody who could just be in and out of everywhere, without really being noticed that much.
all right, interesting. And then, sorry, Chris, I'm gonna steal some of your thunder, but why did she keep the letters? Did she anticipate a need for protection? Like sort of, this I might need to show my side of the story and have some justification for that?
Yeah, the kids have a phrase, keeping receipts, um, which I think is a
I have a
sentiment.
phrase that's much more crude, so yeah, we'll go with keeping receipts. So
And I've started to think of Hamilton as keeping receipts with this correspondence, really. Like I say at the beginning, she's saying, stop writing to me, stop writing to me. And then she just basically gives up because it's clear that he's not going to stop writing to her. Um, and I think she decides a second best, if he's not going to stop writing to her, is to keep very careful records of exactly what he's said and to an extent what she's said, and to keep those in her own hands as much as she can. And you can sort of tell when she's writing to him, she's always also writing for the person who eventually discovers the correspondence, um, and possibly for the Queen, actually, because there are just so many ham-fisted references to your wonderful and magnificent mother who has been so kind and generous to me and is the greatest mother you could ever have hoped for. Oh, what would she think if she knew of your conduct? What would she think of me, even though I really haven't done anything wrong? It's that kind of like laying it on thick. So I think she's constantly thinking, if I have to do this, I'm going to make it the story that I want it to be. And I'm going to be able to point at things and say, look, you can see there, I told him to stop. I told him I wasn't interested. I told him this, I told him that, I told him the other. So yeah, I think that's the rationale, really.
and then I guess I've gotten on a roll here that, sometimes, we look for patterns. I wonder with Harriet Vernon, I'm thinking in terms of a modern womanizer. For you hear the adage for them, it's the thrill of the chase. So with Harriet Vernon, he kind of consummated his objective and then she became disposable. And then he
Mhm.
turns his attention to Mary Hamilton, and then maybe because she constantly threw up defenses and he couldn't break through, then he got tired of that chase and then moved on to, I forget the actress's name, Robinson, I think. So, like, is that part of a pattern of his behavior, or I guess as he was coming of age?
I think, as far as I know, it was. I think what you have to remember about the Harriet Vernon and Mary Hamilton years and the very early part of the Robinson years is that he hadn't yet achieved what he calls his independence. So he hasn't yet turned 21 and he doesn't yet have his own household. So he has a small allowance, but he's basically dependent on his parents still. And that's what gives rise to a lot of friction, especially with his father, who doesn't approve of his behavior. So he lives in court, he doesn't have his own house, and he sort of his palette, if you like, his kind of menu of the ladies available is quite restricted. And Hamilton is always actually telling him that. She's always saying, stop saying that I'm the most beautiful woman in the world. This is patently ridiculous. You only get to see about 2 dozen women. When you have your independence and when you leave court, you will see that there are actually many, many more beautiful women in the world. And then, of course, this prophecy not only comes true, but, kind of comes true to times infinity. Once the prince has his own independence and he kind of has his constitutional allowance that, kind of effectively means he doesn't need to please his parents anymore, he just goes absolutely wild and he has, all the mistresses all the time. But at this time, it's a very cloistered, very claustrophobic community that he's living in. And I'm not saying this as any sort of defense, the options open to him if he's, sort of feeling adolescent urges, are basically his parents' employees. So I think that context is really, really important to, well, everything about the correspondence, really.
Okay, thank you. Chris, back to you. I've exhausted my list.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm just going to put out one last call. It doesn't seem like we have any questions in the chat, but maybe that's just because you answered everybody else's as well as mine in anticipation. But we'll just give it a few more seconds if anybody wants to pop something in there. And then while we're waiting, this might be, in fact, not just might be. It is asking a question that's going to ask for a lot of speculation on your part. But I'm wondering, I really appreciated you kind of setting the historiography of what we've seen previously. But I wonder about the motivations of sort of previous people dismissing this as sort of a romantic love story. And I sort of wrote down, is this to highlight how far he falls later in life? Or is this sort of a dismissal of, boys will be boys sort of thing? Did you, in sort of the previous, did you get any notion of why this was sort of dismissed, or was it just a product of its times and the 1970s? This is what we thought boys did.
Yeah. So I think the two books written by Hamilton's descendants, I think what they're trying to do is make a case for their ancestors' importance, because at the beginning of the 20th century, it's kind of thought like having letters written to you by a royal was sort of one of the most important things that you could do. And, they're constantly justifying their decision to, publish this account of their ancestors' life. But they also don't want to imply there was anything unsavory or immoral about it. So they're kind of flagging it up, but also saying, oh, motherly interest, affectionate friendship, this kind of thing. I think that's what they're doing. I think the boys will be boys mentality has a lot to answer for. And I think if you look at it in the context of George IV's overall life, that context sets it off differently than if it had been a monarch who was supremely well behaved thereafter. If it was George III, for example, if he'd done this, I mean, he's this kind of famously this very devoted, boring family man for most of his life. So I think it could, if you're looking for a contrast, a reason why it's interesting, if he'd done this, then it might be seen as kind of something that was a bit more naughty. And I don't think it would ever actually get beyond naughty until the much later 20th century, early 21st. But with George IV, because he's such a complete rotter for most of his life, and everybody accepts and acknowledges that, I think the contrast almost works the other way. The interest of the story for all the biographers I've read, pretty much, is, oh, but isn't this sweet? Isn't this doesn't this add some texture and some layers to, the kind of rotter and scoundrel that we then see later on? He was this little boy with a crush. Um, and they, that's what I think it's difficult to generalize, but that's what I think they are getting at. They want to produce a textured, layered, three-dimensional portrayal of their subject, and it helps them to do that if this is actually a kind of a different dimension rather than sort of more of the same. And what they're not aiming to do is tell Mary Hamilton's story. And they often get her name wrong, actually. Um, yeah. So I think that's probably the best answer I can give.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm asking you for the motivations of other people, which is not really fair, but I really appreciate your answer. And This has been absolutely fantastic. I see that there's no questions in the chat, so I will just leave it to say thank you so much for bringing this forward, and of course when I first saw sort of what you were writing on and your links on Twitter, it was just absolutely fascinating, and I went, yeah, we have to ask her nicely if she'll come and speak to us. So we really appreciate you giving your time today, and thank you so much.
It's
And
really
I'm
been
gonna
my pleasure. Thank you for being such generous hosts, and yeah, I've had a really good time.
thank
Good,
you so
good, good.
much.
It was a lot of fun. And just as we wrap this up to our viewing audience or subsequent viewers, like the video, subscribe to the channel. That's the best way you can help us out. So without any further ado, I'm going to cut this off. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Sophie. That was thoroughly enjoyable. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.